Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this beautiful November evening. I'm Lauren Gottlieb Miller. I'm the librarian at the Menil collection, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce poet Adam Vines. Adam is Associate Professor of English at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where he's the editor of the Birmingham Poetry Review. He's the author of Out of Speech, published this year by Louisiana State University Press, and The Coal Life, published by University of Arkansas Press in 2012. He's the co-author of two poetry collections, Day Kink, published this year, and According to Discretion in 2015, both published by Unicorn Press. His poems have appeared in Poetry, the Kenyon Review, Southwest Review, Gulf Coast, Ecotone, the Hopkins Review, 5 Points, the Literary Review, Cincinnati Review, and Subtropics, among others. He's won awards for his teaching from the University of Alabama at Birmingham and the University of Florida, and has received fellowships from the Rivendell Writers Colony, Alabama State Council on the Arts, and the Sewanee Writers Conference. During the summers, he is on staff at the Sewanee Writers Conference. Please give a warm Houston welcome to Adam Vines.
Wow. This museum had a huge influence on the collection. I went all over the nation. I was fortunate enough to receive some grants to visit museums. So I went to New York for 10 days, visited the Guggenheim, the Frick, the Whitney, MoMA, the Met. Went to Philadelphia, went to DC, where else? Boston, Chicago, and spent some time in France and Spain. And the last collection, or the last poem, I wrote in Buenos Aires when I was on the way to Antarctica, of all places. I ended up writing a couple of books with a polar biologist on climate change, and I went to Antarctica with him and kind of tripped into the last poem. I started writing these poems because when I was in my teens and early 20s, I stretched canvas. I painted, sketched, but I also worked full-time when I was in school. I started a landscaping company when I was 18, and I had to make some hard decisions when I ran into poetry. I had to figure out what I was going to do. If I was going to be a dilettante and try to write poetry, try to paint, try to go to school, or I was going to figure out what I really needed to do, which was write. So when I ended up in my mid-30s selling my company and deciding that I was going to go off to school and learn to write poetry, whatever that means, and trick my wife into going with me when she was 1 year from being vested, and to live like graduate students again when we had a house, and to put off our child and everything else. It was a tough decision. I ended up getting a job, luckily. And for my second collection, I decided I was going to write these poems. I knew that I had to see the paintings live. I'd written ekphrastic poems before and looked at books, looked at computer screens, thought about paintings I'd seen before, but I was missing the scale, the texture, and most importantly, the social atmosphere of the museum, which always intrigued me. There's a certain reverence when people walk into a museum that almost disturbs me at times. I wish that we had a little parlor next to some of these wonderful paintings where I could step off as a country boy so excited about a Picasso and have people who would step in with me, and we could get excited about it and scream and jump up and down, because it seems like that's what I wanted to do more than anything, was connect with people. But people tend to walk up to paintings and do this. And if you talk about them, they look at you like you just poked them in the eye sometimes. You gotta be quiet. I don't like that. And then you have the people who look at the paintings and they say things like, "Who would eat a peacock pie?" And they don't want you to respond to them. But I tended to. I'd say, "I would." What do you mean you would? All those blue eyes flirting at you? How could you not eat that peacock pie? And then you have the people on a date, and you have the one person who's talking very loudly about Kandinsky's blue period that never occurred. And then you have docents in some museums who are speaking to children and should never be speaking to children, who are ruining their art experience. So all the theories that I used in my scholarship when I was interested in literary works as a scholar, the social theories, the psychological theories, they started to come into focus as I was witnessing these people. And then I decided that I wasn't going to merely write about what was in the interior of that frame, what was encapsulated, but I was going to stretch the frame around the people in the museum. I was going to stretch the frame around the physical edifice. I was going to stretch the frame and allow myself to walk inside with my subjective renderings and whatever else was happening. When I went to New York, that was the first big city I'd ever been to. Like I said, I grew up a country boy out in a really, really rural part of Alabama. My father was a bricklayer. I come from a coal mining family. I'm a blue-collar worker at heart. So when I went to New York, I stepped out, tried to call a cab, and guess what? No cab stopped. I had no idea what those lights on top meant. So that day I walked 90 blocks. And that was the very best thing that ever could have happened to me, to be introduced to a big city like that. So I walked up to Museum Mile, walked into the Met for the first time, but it was only after I'd been on the streets for hours, walking in and out of coffee shops, hearing 4 and 5 different languages on the street, just being completely enthralled with the city itself, which again influenced the way that I saw the art. I'm going to start out reading a poem that I wrote here. Breakfast at the Menil, after Dali's eggs on the plate without the plate. Always time stretched to its limit, the bezel unfazed, the hour in a drip I would have flicked out of impatience or boredom. Sunny side up I ordered this morning, though at home I scramble. The 2 eggs couple on Dali's plate, the one overhead hanging like a head of garlic, the yolk a window, a cross subsumed by an empty box. Ride the carrot sheath to the green tops and scale the hole with me, where a pappy and his grand find yellow for the first time, not the yolk, not a rain slicker, but this yellow they see in this moment with me while breakfast goes chillingly cold. Another poem I wrote here is after a Tanguy poem, Les Vieux. And I had some pretty extraordinary experiences with people when I was traveling. This particular day, I'd been here all day, walked back to across from Rice, where I was staying in a hotel. And I decided I was going to get a beer before I went upstairs and started looking at what I'd sketched that day and what I'd written. Because in my moleskin, I always sketch on one side and then I write on the other. I have to see things spatially. And I would sketch the paintings. Well, when I walked into the bar, there was a guy sitting there, and he turned around, he looked at me, he had a cowboy hat on, and he said, "I bet you fish." And I'm an avid fisherman, and it was really odd. And he was about 2 sheets to the wind already. He said, "Sit down and have a whiskey with me." And I said, "Okay." So he started ordering whiskeys from the top shelf, $18, $20, $24 shots of whiskey. Then he ordered an 18-year Pappy Van Winkle shot, which was about $45, $50. And then he looked at me and he said, "You know what? I haven't had a drink in 8 years. I said, "Well, son, what's wrong with you then?" And he looked at me, he said, "I'm dying." He said, "I was just diagnosed with a stage 4 glioblastoma." At that time, I was losing my best friend of 40 years of the same exact thing, a stage 4 glioblastoma. So I sat there with him for 3 or 4 hours and then went home and started looking over what I'd written that day about this painting. And of course, what happened to me in that bar is reflected in the poem. My view from here. Like a man running away from his tumor, legs fuzzy with speed, skull contorting to the cancer's protean form, a bicuspid plied from the roots, enamel gone, dentin starting to slouch like pudding. Stages 2, 3 lurking on the desert floor below him. Stage 4 suspended behind him like a vodka bottle barked with decades of wax. Like the cowboy last night at the hotel bar who had already drunk his way through the top shelf whiskey, who asked if I fished before I'd slid halfway onto the bar stool. Like his unfettered cough of a confession that these were the first drinks he had knocked back in 8 years. Like the biopsy results he received earlier that day, the hospital bed and gown he refused, the surgery, radiation, chemo, lab rat shit he won't do. Like the 3 phone calls from MD Anderson, his ringtone set to the Jaws theme while he talked about native cutthroat, and his girlfriend sat motionless, her eyes full of agency at first, then dropped to the overwrought fried green tomatoes she wouldn't touch. Like my best friend and fishing buddy of 40 years in his last hour of gurgling, his final movements trying to wipe away his piss as if some primitive reflex awakened by dignity. Like a bass lumbering in deep water at his pond during winter, like his patience, twitching a jig all day in hope of one big bite. Like the glioblastoma the cowboy and my best friend shared, the food they could no longer taste, the splinters in their necks, the names of their children lost in pill bottles. Like the me I see now in Lakeview, the gray smudge and outline of something that they never catch up to, no matter how fast they run, no matter how long I wait for them. This is a poem that Gulf Coast published here in Houston, Blind Spot, after Warhol's Rorschach. Too easy to say Shiva or Janus or butterfly effect or tree of life or Christmas wreath because it is December, or hood ornament or Pompeii or ball mask or burgundy mask or drop zone or topo map or gilded intestines, Barney's, Wall Street. Instead, please see a honey pea inscribed inside a Wonder Bread fold-over. The Philosophy of Subtraction, after Hopper's excursion into philosophy. Beds and everything today. My borrowed one back at the Marriott, comforter bunched at the foot, my dress socks slung into folds like half-dress game. Seems to be snowing everywhere but here and in Birmingham, where my wife and daughter are home early from school, despite no accumulation, both at the kitchen table, I'm sure. My daughter's soup getting cold while she drills her dolls on subtraction. My wife lassoing poor conjugations, slashing l'accent grave aigu. The crock pot squatting behind them, breaking down muscle, fat, softening carrots, potato skins loosening, leftovers I'll eat on Sunday when I return. This morning, I bet my wife pulled the sheets and bedspread extra tight before tucking in the pillows and scraped the lowboy clean of my change and receipts on her way to the shower. And like you, Hopper's man, I want to see something, anything, but a bed and the rectangle of light before me. My hand curled into my inner thigh, too. Shirt tripped open as I slump. I, too, no longer feel the woman beside me in bed, friend. I too see the pages blank in books I left open the night before. I too can't bear my foot toeing into the light. Having bummed a smoke outside of the National Gallery, though I have quit. This epigraph from Eliot. And if it rains, a closed car at 4, and we shall play a game of chess. The trees stick out their tongues at all of us, squatting at their trunks, while wild onions fall limp at their tips like month-old mohawks. Candy-coated tourist buses park toe to heel. Yesterday, sushi and a slipped-off boot and socked foot in the lap for lunch, and noodles and beef alone in Chinatown last night. Will another woman ever place her handbag on the grass, commando crawl to it, finger the stalk eye of her camera, and snap 20 shots of the Capitol dome perched upon her slouched purse like a Pope's mitre? Would Cezanne study this team of Segways rolling past with their unmanned eyes and overripened helmets? Would Rousseau replace the mannered Samoyed with a jeweled collar and thin leash and hook up this albino squirrel begging for a cheese Danish instead, stroking it wild as the boy in a harness pulling with all his strength against his mother's thick strap, the Washington Monument distending from his hunched back. Modigliani wouldn't have to stretch the mother's face beyond the long length it has become. The stoled woman reckoning a clause in the gallery asked no one out loud who would eat a peacock pie, all its feathers in a vase beside it, and all of those blue eyes flirting with you, I responded, and I would. So a lot of these autobiographical instances came in. When I was in Philadelphia, it's a wonderful museum there. So I visited the Philadelphia Museum and another museum, and I walked outside for a while just to get a breath of fresh air, and I noticed something extraordinary, the Rocky statue down at the bottom. And all of the buses and all the cars that pulled up and all these hyper-masculine guys getting out and running up to Rocky and patting him on the thigh and on the butt and grabbing a hold of him. It was incredibly and wonderfully homoerotic, and they didn't even realize what was happening. And after about 500 Yo Adrians, I decided I had to sit down and write about it. So I spent my 5 hours outside looking at people running up to the Rocky statue. Back to the old city after A. Thomas Schomburg's Rocky. How cordial, the cars and delivery trucks rounding the fountains and bronzes, the patina teal as it should be, fine mist of rain, barely perceptible, hawks circling the stairs where children raise their arms in victory, and all of the men, cheeked in the remnants of their vainglory, gather around Rocky's knees, fists balled above their heads. They will not run up the stairs, nor will I, middle-age and untenable shoes, the likenesses we shun but share. The buses exhaust themselves on the curb, noses sliming the window like slugs. Only a few pass the tents set up for a beer tasting to enter the museum. The rest open their umbrellas, garish perennials blooming too early, and find their way, partly convinced of their greatness, into the old city staged across the sky before us, the faint cries of Yo Adrian, unlike birdsong, behind. Astral image is ensign, after Rothko's astral image. Make me your jelly, the tumescence of seed and gelatin, then boil and reduce me, leave me to cool. Peel off the caramelized sheaf of me from the pot's gut, carve out a pyramid with my navel at its core, my knot of lineal thread, my dent of identity. Another extraordinary experience I had was at MoMA. And what are we taught to do when we go into museums when we're kids? Don't touch anything. Be quiet and don't touch a damn thing. I remember my mother saying that to me at the small museum we went to in Birmingham. Well, at MoMA, there was this pile of candy. Have you seen the pile of candy? And above it, it says, you've got this wonderful neon sign that has death and eat within it. And it's an interactive installation where people are supposed to go up and take the candy and start eating it. But of course, we're taught not to touch anything. So people are so distrustful. So everyone's standing around this candy pile. They're looking at it. And one thing they're not doing is reading the placard over there. They're not reading the artist's statement, so they don't understand what's going on. And then all of a sudden, this wonderful woman comes up. She's got a purse slung over. She's got these beautiful rainbow socks. And she just walks right up to it, grabs a big handful, and walks away. And then everybody's eyes just went open. They said, oh my God. So they sneak over, grab a piece, opening it up, put it in their mouth. And before long, everybody's around the pile and they're eating candy. And it was just this beautiful experience. However, none of them read the artist's statement. The artist's statement was that his lover's ideal weight was 175 pounds. So that pile of candy weighs 175 pounds. And at the end of the day, they'll weigh the pile and then replenish the pile to 175 pounds. His lover was dying of AIDS. And it was a kind of lovely transubstantiation that was happening with people picking up the candy, taking it in. I heard people saying prayers, I heard people laughing, but people still didn't understand really what the artist's statement was behind the pile. I talked to a few people about it at that time, but so I just sat there and watched people and how they reacted to the pile. Also, I brought in 4 or 5 other paintings while I was writing about the pile. A study of intergroup reconciliation. After Naumann's Eat Death, Gonzalez-Torres' Untitled Portrait of Ross in L.A., Warhol's 25 Colored Marilyns, and Nolan's Blue Wall. On the fluorescent sign, I tried to read as diner. Eat ripens orange as coiled eyes on a stove inside the D and H buttressing death. And piled beside it, hard candy, like cabochon-cut jewels, begs us to take and eat this gift and thus diminish its ideal weight of 175 pounds. And we do. First, the woman with rainbows on her fleece socks for 3 butterscotches. Then a bald man fingers a cinnamon round and whispers a prayer, I'm close enough to eat. And I bow my head and close my eyes with him. We all eat and eat and eat, the spicy, the sweet, like what took the artist's love from him, and wait for the replenished pile his statement promises. 25 Marilyns nod and lip from the next room, lemon hair tunneling across her foreheads, mint eyeshadow and collars still lingering in the roofs of our mouth. Oswald paper punched 7 times, his body reddening, would curse us as fools of art if the flag were not stuffed into his mouth like a gag. My daughter always says that I have to read poems about her at readings. And she'll say, Daddy, are you going to read poems about me? And I'll say, yeah. And then she'll look at me and she'll go, no, I want you to read all poems about me. This is one poem about her that I'll read. Homunculus' Daughter, after Bonnard's La Peignoir. She sleeps in her skin, chin tucked into her chest like a pigeon on a power line. Hair brushed and brushed, then pinned. My daughter says mermaid, the woman's chiffon flaring with gold carp scales, lily pads floating above her head like empty thought bubbles. Where my daughter sees a fishtail, I plead for rectrices, a bit of down beaked to the surface and preened, the signature an ibis head. When I say the daisy petals behind the bird woman prove she is on land, my daughter says, "Silly daddy, those are ice minnows tickling her back to wake her up from a nap." And at once, water and air are no longer distinct elements and pathways, and I truly understand why one must concede even if one is right. Oh, sexy. Let's do it the other way. All I need is a little light right here. I'll get out a pen light. I mentioned earlier that I really wanted to interact with people. I wanted to talk to people about the art. As someone who started out as a visual artist and engaged in a lot of quick contour line drawings when I was trying to figure out form, I was thrilled when I got to go to the Guggenheim and see Picasso's quick contours. And while I was there and winding up the Guggenheim, we all had on our earbuds and were listening about the art. And then when we got to the very top where there's the cafe and there's a couple of Kandinsky's that I really, really love, everybody kept their earbuds in. And it's kind of like, I learned on the subway, people will put them in even if they're not listening to anything because they don't want to engage with other people. It was like people were scared to take them out because they'd start engaging with one another. So this poem takes place at the end of what I found so thrilling. Social capital and the introduction of the vanilla egg, after Kandinsky's Small Pleasures and Yellow Cow. A pile of sheep or armful of balloons, dribbling trail of purses opening in unison, unnecessary cane. Dreamsicle scarf corkscrewing the neck, but we distrust Kandinsky's pleasures in the overpriced cafe where the tour ends almost as much as each other. Our headphones still cupping our ears for safety from each other. If I carved with my pen the front leg of Yellow Cow for brisket, would security let me be? Would everyone unplug, order the blue ribs, the black hooves haft from me? And after we partook, who would divide the vanilla egg beneath her udder so we could share, all of us share, something sweet? Scholar's advice after Rothko's Untitled Seagram mural sketch. The scholars warn, don't mistake it for a whore's door or heaven's lore or the poor or, God forbid, boorish spores or s'mores, context, imposition, children, or a pompadour, orange paint weeping from its wick, or existential gore, or a haphazard pour of caution cone, or windows scored by a soothsayer drunk, or eyes pied, squared, then cord, or sores of an invalid left to flounder on the tile floor, which in my ramblings here I find my father, cord pulled while on the pot, embolism, a few minutes and gone. A hole within a hole of the whole, a thought without thought they would want me to see. Pander to my drama and despair scholars. My mind fancies to open the door and to lie on the floor where my father was no more. When the elephant leaves the room after Magritte's La Chambre d'écoute. Untusk the elephant, tickle the peanuts from its trunk, grab its riding crop tail and back it out of the room. Roll in apple, green, 2 weeks from ripe. Slide into a wingback and wait for Miss Rapandra to say, the teacups are a bit pedestrian for the scones, don't you think? Watch the apples swell, juice filling the scars in the oak floor. The host tries to nudge the apple under the punch table, but it is already too large. Watch it swell and swell, green stretching its limits and splinting into tertiaries, the guests becoming louder and louder in willful ignorance. Watch the crown molding accept the shadows of the stem, of people now skirting the room's edges like camel crickets, their voices pressing into a single note, a single reverberation just below the summit of F. Listen to the apple in the room. It's a poem I wrote at Rothko Chapel. It's the first spatial poem I've ever written. And LSU decided to print it like this, and I'm still not sure if I like that or not. But when I stepped into the Rothko Chapel, the spare nature of it, the people in there, the pallid walls, the Rothkos that seemed so unlike Rothko if you didn't know him, not looking like the maritime flags, but those different variations of black. I thought of Mark Strand, who's a wonderful poet who won the Pulitzer Prize, is a MacArthur genius, and notorious for kind of being a jerk also. But I was fortunate enough to spend 10 or 11 summers with him at the Sewanee Writers Conference, and I wouldn't let him be a jerk to me, so we became friends. And we would play poker late at night with a couple of other poets, and he's kind of an existentialist. He's also he was a painter and an abstract expressionist. I don't think many people knew that, but a few of the covers for his collections were pieces that he had painted. He was also an art critic, and the last piece he was working on before he died was a piece of art criticism on Hopper that Mary Jo Salter ended up picking up and finishing. But this is in memory of Mark Strand. When I visited Rothko Chapel, Mark had only been dead about 3 months, and I just felt his presence in the chapel. At Rothko Chapel, in memory of Mark Strand. All silent prayers, and I see you in the confusion of positive and negative space, absence and presence, what is not and what is. Poker late one night with you, clubs and spades, black, suspended, and white. You caught in a bluff, nothing, you said, as if bestowing us what was left of you. Dark purple lines at the centers of the creases down your cheeks. A sip of red wine, red Italian glasses, matching red socks, somehow fitting your persnickety simplicity. Like a paper clip made tool by a crow, the biscuit hole in a sheet of dough. One, the vehicle for absence, the other, absence so aware it embodies. Both almost making things whole. Balthus is a creepy dude. And there were a few paintings that I was really attracted to. But I had to I tended to direct my anger at Balthus in these paintings sometimes. Restroke 1 after Balthus's nude before a mirror. The perennials must be on fire outside. The dahlias, jonquils, the lavender water pitcher must have been an afterthought. Its somewhat existence not even worth a reflection. I want her to snap off its handle and slip it over her veiny wrist like a Bakelite bracelet. I want to restroke the canvas, harden that afterthought, and place it in her hands so she can toss it out the open window where Balthus crouches. Fisting the Tyne, after Homer's Girl with Pitchfork. Her blood orchid index finger curls to her thumb in an OK at the crux of the pitchfork, but nothing seems okay. Harbor wind lifting her dress in a cattywampus teepee, haystack, a windowless hut, lighthouse centipeding to the fur line. She will not pitch the hay today, the sky too eerily clear in Homer's overshadowed field. To the man pushing his glasses down to read the brass placard, the pitchfork is a wishbone. He reaches out and pulls down on the tine. Big end is mine, he says to me, but I have no more wishes, and pretends to toss it over his shoulder as he sidesteps to the typical Homer. But the girl in the hayfield would reach down if she could, unclasp her OK, fist the tine, cut a door into the nearest bale, wish herself inside. Not story, after Rothko's street scene. Perhaps he still had crumbs on his lips, his collar, his lap when he unzipped. Perhaps he was still bound in half-sleep, looking back at his memory pressed into the mattress. Perhaps the street lamp's inquisition through the open window persuaded the cracker mattress skyscraper to press its bald head flat against the frame, or the woman horrified by its sight to boil in her own skin, a red almost too orange, crabs dumped across the Sunday news. No one else is hungry or horny here. The brown stripe of a man wedges into a breezeway. A granddaughter, her dress a swarm of chips clipped from the thumb moon, legs simmering from ankle to shin to knee, cooling to pink at the hemline, her arm outstretched, elbowless, impeding her grandmother's path. Rothko said he was no colorist, and a painting is not an experience. Don't be coy. Make me believe in this innocence of nothing, the not story of our lives. I'll read a couple more, and then I'll take some questions. And I can dance, and I can show you how to tie fishing knots. What is not flesh comes to a point. From Rothko's Phalanx of the Mind. Everything is a weapon, the glass pane poised in the geometry of its shanks. Even the shadows, when imposed by the brain's peach pit wrinkles onto what could be floor, ceiling, sky. And all with the same sharp intent, thin, impaled desire. Like an acupuncturist needle, a parabola of musings above, a flaccid tongue in its balmy shadow below, massaging the pain to shatter into the not flesh of us all. The last poem in the collection was a gift. I was walking around in Buenos Aires. I went into a park, sat down, and there was a street artist who was sketching something on a piece of cardboard. I brought out my moleskin, just started writing, and I was writing about this street artist for about 30 minutes. And then I noticed when I kept looking up at him, he was looking up at me. So I would look up from writing, and he would look up at me, which I thought was odd. And then I would look up again, and he would look up at me. And we looked at each other for long, like this, and then he smiled, and I smiled. And then he did this, and he was sketching me while I was writing about him. So he came over in my Spanish and in his broken English, we talked and we hugged. And he lived in the banyan tree roots. And he invited me into his home, and we sat there for 3 or 4 hours. And it was an extraordinary experience where art brought us together. And it transcended everything, language barriers, or cultural backgrounds. And in the end, he gave me the sketch of him, or of me, and then I gave him the draft of the poem that I was writing about him. Later on that afternoon, I went back, and because now I no longer have my draft, I had to write again. So there's quite a bit of metadrama in here. There's an awareness of the art that was the art. Restroke 3, Still Life with Banyan Tree. A wreck of elephants that took root. The homeless settle inside channels of its dugout canoes, lined with faded drapes. The dog sitter's body sickles against his leash of horny mutts. Pigeons blink amber oil and bone. 3 girls with heels and skirts too high and hyacinths blinking from their crowbar waists ring around a lamppost, its steepled hat aslant, a drunken clown. And I, the watcher, am being watched. My arm drapes across a cankled root, my heels fused, knees spread, void between, like a dugout canoe. The cardboard sketch the man with blinking eyes hands me. And in return, I rip out the poem this one was. We even trade. He slips into the banyan tree's dugout canoe. I uncap my pen and turn the page. Thank you. Questions?
I've got a mic here. If anybody has questions, just raise your arm.
Comments? Fruit to throw at me? When my students don't speak, I bring in a 5-gallon bucket of melted butter. I've got it next to me. I haul it in like a sheetrock, but I've worked on houses for years. I set that big old thing of melted butter down. And I'll get out these old tube socks I had from when I was a teenager, with the 3 yellow stripes on it, and I'll start tying it in a big knot. They don't know what I'm doing. I'm not sure what I'm doing. Tying it in a big knot. Then, when no one's talking still, I dip that sock down in that melted butter. And then I'll ask a question, we'll try some Socratic method. If that doesn't work, I'll just look around, and then I'll throw it from right in the chest. And the great thing about a butter sock is, it doesn't really hurt, but that will never get that stain out, ever. Melted butter stain. And I'm kind of sad I don't have a butter sock here. Because I'd wail my friend right now, and he would ask a question. Yes, sir.
So why did you choose ekphrastic poetry?
Why did I choose it? I chose it because I adored painting. I had to put painting down because I had to make a hard decision about what I was going to do in my spare time. I worked 50 hours a week, and I went to school at night. I didn't have a whole lot of time, and I didn't have time anymore to stretch canvas. So it was easier for me to think about poetry. So I would read poetry, and I could write poetry while I was working, while I was up in a tree trimming limbs, or while I was, digging a ditch, or when I was laying sod, or when I was designing a landscape. I always had this part of my mind that was occupied with poetry. So I can't do it anymore. I've got a dumber over the years, but I used to be able to work on things like that in my head, and have word banks, and work through poems in my head as I worked my body. And it just made practical sense. So when I became an academic and had to start writing more and more, and I was finished with my first election, which took place on the river, and it was more about labor, I decided I was going to get back into painting again. And I painted with the pen instead of with a paintbrush. It was really quite thrilling. I mean, the first time I went to, say, the Whitney, or Oh, I thought you were, yeah. Sure.
You have a poem where you talk about a painting of Hopper's, where there's a book that's not, I don't know if it's empty or it's blank. And I'm curious if you could just speak a little bit more as a poet looking at this painting with the empty or blank book in it.
Yeah, I mean, this particular painting by Hopper, I love Hopper because of, there's always the possibility of intimacy that never really happens in a Hopper. And I love the narrative arcs and the juxtapositions in a Hopper painting and the geometry of a Hopper painting. In this particular Hopper painting, the title is Excursion into Philosophy. But it's a bedroom scene. So you've got a guy sitting on a bed that looks like a half-inch piece of plywood that's been put into a box with a sheet put over it. No one's pressing into it. It's hard as a rock. Everything's made out of rectangles. Everything in the room. Even the man's body. And he's staring down into this rectangle of light. The woman's objectified. Her hiney's hanging out. She's staring at the wall, or you think she is. And you're trying to put together the narrative. What's beautiful about Hopper is, he has color theory, light source, all these things. He draws our eyes around that narrative arc. Well, generally Hopper waits until the fourth or fifth move to take us to the most important part of the poem, which is the man's foot, I think, which is either sliding into the light or it's moving out of the light. We don't know which one it's doing. But it's that wonderful trope that's happening there. After you reach that point, there's this book on the bed. And the book's open, and it looks blank, and we're left to question whether he opened it, whether it was left open. Is it a diary? Is it a Bible? Is it, what is it? And for me, it was one of the most important parts of the book, so it became of the poem, it became the penultimate image before the foot that's sliding in and out. For Hopper, that open book with no letters in it, I think is for us to fill the page a bit. It's to occupy that narrative in some sense. And for me, that open book, how did I say it? Let me look. I should memorize some of these things. I too see the pages blank in the books I left open the night before. You're a writer. Isn't that so true? When we write the night before, we open it up. We don't know what we wrote the night before, and sometimes we're glad that we don't remember what the impetus was because we want to toss it immediately. We wish that the pages were blank. So yeah, as a writer, that particular part of the painting spoke to me pretty clearly. Yes?
What do you think the biggest piece of advice would be to give someone who wants to pursue a career in writing?
Read. Get as many tools for your toolbox as you can. I'm also an editor, and I read about 8,500 poems a year as an editor. I'm a teacher, so I see, a lot of poems come past me. I'm also I'm involved with a couple of presses where I read about 120 manuscripts a year. And what I see more than anything are people who fall into default modes. They fall into the same kind of default syntax. They fall into the same kind of image patterns. Their friction and viscosity of lines seem to be very, very similar. My suggestion would be to start out as a great painter would and learn as much as you can about form, even if you're going to break away from form, and read as many contemporary poems as you can, but also look back at some of the older poems. That's something that I really had to catch up on, was reading poetry. And I don't think I really progressed as a writer until I really sat down and started reading and annotating. Don't just read, but mark moves that you admire. Figure out why something's working. I wish that I had some of my poetry books, that I read, because they're just filled up with scribbles, and I've circled something. I've got, oh my God, a delayed verb here. That's what made it. Or the delayed subject here. Or someone subordinating X and bringing it down to here. Starting a quarter of the way in and moving a quarter of the way out. I mean, all those little moves that, the great thing about being a poet is we lie and we steal. I could never write nonfiction. That's no fun at all. But I love to lie and steal. So yeah, lie and steal. And allow your imagination to flow too. Too many people that I see also stay too occupied in the literal, and they don't allow the imagination. As Wallace Stevens says, this kind of wonderful blending of reality and the imagination, imaginary gardens with real toads in them, as Marianne Moore says. Yes? When I first started writing, I couldn't get out of the river. The big joke with the Vines family is we spawned in the Weir River. And I still have a little piece of crawdad tail that I can flip and scuttle backwards when I get scared. So I couldn't get out of the river for some reason. So I wrote about the river as much as anything. I wrote about the natural world. I thought that's all I could write about. Then I stepped back and wrote about the coal mining community in the early 20th century because I was kind of hiding my relationship with my father. I thought about later, and so I took these personae. And then some of these poems I wrote weird collaborative, or I write weird collaborative poetry with an aerialist with Cirque du Soleil in Las Vegas. These are the biggest show in the world, the Beatles' love show in Mirage. We went to graduate school together. And he was the smart one. We supplemented our income by playing poker. And he went to Vegas and became a grinder. And then, for about 5 years played poker, and then decided he was going to get into aerialism. And after 5 years after that, beat out former Olympians for this thing. I mean, he's amazing. He was on America's Got Talent. And Heidi Klum asked him to take his shirt off. That's his claim. You can look it up. It's kind of embarrassing. So I did that to get out of the voice and to challenge myself. And then with this new collection I'm working on right now, maybe I should have read some of those poems. I'm writing a lot about my daughter. I'm writing a lot about my relationship with my wife. And those started to come out a little bit in these poems. You heard about love. I didn't mean for it to, but it did. Mostly because I was homesick. It's lonely staying in hotels at night. As thrilling as the days were, those nights were really lonely. So they entered in. Now I'm allowing myself for the first time to really write about my relationship with my daughter. And many of the poems I'm writing now are about the questions that she asks. Kids are so precocious and brilliant. We learn so much from them. And, she asked me one day, she's like, "What's it like to be a boy, Daddy? We're eating beans, Oh, God, here we go." So I started thinking about Tiresias and all this, kind of highfalutin academic crap, and I'm still not saying anything. And then she looks up, she goes, "Penis seems like a lot of trouble." She's 8 years old, And we never call it the we or the woo or anything like that. I mean, it's just, she's thinking, and I'm like, God, what do I do now? So I'll tell this story of when I was a kid, and my mother called it a front tail. Yeah. So, sorry. It's not embarrassing to me. So I was in school in 3rd grade, and I was like, "Yeah, I got a front tail." Everyone said, "No, you don't." I said, "Yeah, I do." So I'm a front tail. You got kicked out of school, But that's what happens when you call it a front tail. That's why you don't do that thing, parents. You don't see it's a woo-woo. No, it's not a damn woo-woo. It's not. So yeah, that, and then one night we watched the Women's Marches on Washington 2 years ago. And she watched it with us, and we talked to her about why this was happening, why these women are wearing white, what are the arguments. And the next morning I always go in to wake her up before it gets light outside, and she opened her eyes and she looked at me, it was dark, and she said, "Do we deserve to live?" Even address something. It's not how do we live or why do we live, those kinds of questions that biological questions that kids ask, but do we
Well, thank you, Adam. He's going to sign books if you'd like.